Welcome to the Short Scary Stories channel. Our story today is entitled, The Shadow Man. It was a dark and stormy night, and the wind was howling outside of the small cabin in the woods. Amy had been looking forward to her weekend getaway for months, but now that she was here, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The cabin was isolated, and the woods were dense and foreboding, but she tried to brush off her fears and enjoy the solitude. As she sat by the fire, reading a book, she heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, but she couldn't be sure. She got up and walked to the window, but she couldn't see anything in the darkness. She shrugged it off as her imagination and went back to her book. As the night wore on, the strange noises continued. Amy tried to ignore them, but they grew louder and more persistent. She could hear footsteps, whispers, and even the sound of something scratching at the door. She felt a sense of dread wash over her, and she began to regret coming to the cabin. But then, something even more terrifying happened. She saw a shadow move across the room out of the corner of her eye. She turned to face it, but there was nothing there. She brushed it off as a trick of the light and tried to go back to sleep. But as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She felt a presence in the room with her, something dark and malevolent. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The feeling grew stronger and stronger until she couldn't take it anymore. As she sat up in bed, she saw him. The Shadow Man. He was tall and thin, with long fingers and piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. He was dressed in a black suit, and his face was obscured by the shadows. Amy screamed and tried to run, but the Shadow Man was too fast. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back, his grip like a vice. She struggled and fought, but it was no use. The Shadow Man was too strong. He dragged her through the cabin, his grip never loosening. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped, at the mercy of this dark and malevolent force. As they reached the front door, the Shadow Man stopped and turned to face her. His eyes seemed to bore into her soul, and she felt a sense of terror wash over her. She knew that she was in grave danger. But then, something strange happened. The Shadow Man began to shrink and fade away, until he was nothing more than a faint shadow on the floor. Amy watched in disbelief as the shadow disappeared completely, leaving her alone in the darkness. She sat there for hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been a nightmare? A hallucination? But she knew that it was real. The bruises on her arm from where the Shadow Man had grabbed her were proof enough. The next morning, she packed her bags and left the cabin, never looking back. She couldn't explain what had happened to her, but she knew that she had narrowly escaped a terrible fate. As she drove away, she couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if she hadn't been able to escape. Would she have become like the others, lost and trapped in the Shadow Man's grasp? She shuddered at the thought, and vowed never to return to the cabin in the woods. But the Shadow Man was not finished with her yet. As she drove down the winding country road, she saw a figure in the distance. It was the Shadow Man, his tall and thin frame standing out against the backdrop of the forest. She gasped and slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The Shadow Man was standing in the middle of the road, blocking her path. She tried to back up, but the Shadow Man was too fast. He grabbed the door handle and pulled it open, his piercing eyes locking onto hers. She screamed and tried to fight, but it was no use. The Shadow Man was too strong. He pulled her out of the car and dragged her into the forest. She tried to scream, but her voice was hoarse from the terror. She could feel his grip tightening around her, squeezing the life out of her. As they reached a clearing in the woods, the Shadow Man stopped and released her. She fell to the ground, gasping for air. The Shadow Man stood over her, his eyes piercing into hers once again. "I have been watching you, Amy," he said, his voice deep and menacing. "You are strong. You have the potential to become one of my chosen ones." Amy tried to crawl away, but the Shadow Man grabbed her by the ankle and dragged her back. He leaned in close, his breath cold against her face. "You can join me, Amy," he said. "You can become one of the shadows. Together, we can rule over the darkness." Amy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. She knew that she couldn't join the Shadow Man. She had to fight back, to escape his grasp. With a burst of adrenaline, she kicked the Shadow Man in the face and scrambled to her feet. She ran through the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the Shadow Man's angry whispers behind her, but she didn't look back. As she emerged from the woods, She saw a car coming down the road. She waved her arms frantically, and the car screeched to a stop. An older couple got out, their faces full of concern. "Are you okay?" they asked. Amy nodded, too shaken to speak. She got into their car, and they drove her to the nearest town. She called the police and reported the incident, but they didn't believe her. They thought that she was just another crazy person, that she had imagined the whole thing. But Amy knew the truth. She had come face to face with the Shadow Man, and she had narrowly escaped his grasp. She knew that he was real, and that he was out there, waiting in the darkness for his next victim. Years passed, and Amy tried to put the incident behind her. She moved to another state, changed her name, and tried to start a new life. But she could never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of the Shadow Man's grip on her arm, the sound of his voice in her ear. And then, one night, as she was getting ready for bed, she saw a shadow move across her bedroom floor. It was the Shadow Man, his long fingers reaching out to her. Amy screamed and tried to run, but it was no use. The Shadow Man was too fast, too strong. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her back, his grip like a vice. As he dragged her through the darkness, Amy knew that she was lost. She had escaped him once, but she wouldn't be able to do it again. The Shadow Man had come for her, and there was no escaping his grasp. And so, Amy became one of the shadows, trapped forever in the darkness with the Shadow Man. Her name was forgotten, her life erased. She was just another victim of the Shadow Man, lost in the shadows, never to be seen again.